When James McKenna was elected Director General at the beginning of 2316, he soon made it known that his ambition was to see all of humanity reunited under the auspices of the Terran Hegemony. His first action was to ensure the existing member planets of the old alliance transitioned to the new hegemony, which he achieved in short order, only on a couple of occasions having to resort to the threat of violence. Not all of his immediate neighbours were keen to join, however. Many had learned to get by just fine in the 75 years that had passed since the Demarcation Declaration. Sensing the way the winds were blowing, the worlds of Erai, Quinton and Helen entered into a mutual protection pact in an effort to dissuade the Terran hegemony from moving in their direction. McKenna was unimpressed, and in March launched his first crusade that would see him utterly crush resistance on these worlds and absorb them into the hegemony. The short-lived Lyran Federation was incorporated more peacefully. By the end of 2317, several more planets had been added. Though the cost had been unexpectedly high, the Director General began formulating plans for a second wave. Around them, the independent worlds began to worry. Suddenly, many of the interplanetary squabbles and rivalries that had occupied them over the last few decades were shown to be irrelevant in the face of the outwards expanding hegemony. The change in fortunes for those on Terra became a unifying force for other governments across the Inner Sphere. In the Crucis Reach, Lucian Davian embarked on a voyage that would see him meet the leaders of several surrounding worlds. Inviting each of them to join him at a conference on Delavan, there the governments met to hammer out the details of a new alliance and together signed the Crucis Pact. 20 of those present would sign, though notably Muskegon and Marlette were two of the three that politely declined and left without doing so. In 2317, the Federated Suns was born, with Lucian Davian at its head. 1 year later, in 2318, the Muskegon Empire had a change of heart and willingly joined the Federated Suns. However, dissent among the worker class of this dictatorship increased as they were made aware yet again of how little control they had over their lives. Several decades of trade between the worlds of Baton Katos and Emerson with the neighbouring Chesterton League have resulted in the formation of strong ties with that body. They now declare their independence from the Muskegon Empire, and by extension the Federated Suns, and immediately join the much smaller Chesterton Alliance. Lucian Davian, who was one of the most skilled diplomats of his day, now flexed his military muscles and called on the planets of the Federated Suns to raise an army with which to take back these worlds. Their subsequent invasion couldn't have gone much worse and resulted in a humiliating defeat for the Suns at the hands of the much smaller Chesterton League. In a forward direction, Shiro Kirita was ready to dispense with all pretense and declare the founding of his new dynasty. In December of 2319, the old alliance of Galadon was officially disbanded and the new Draconis Combine would take its place, with House Kirita firmly established at its head. In 2320, James McKenna began the next wave of the conquest for the Terran hegemony. By this point, he had established a standard operating procedure for the invasion of worlds. First, a fleet of warships would arrive in system and dispatch any resistance at the jump points. Only after control had been established were the troop transports waiting at a neighbouring star called in. Afterwards, the Hegemony armed forces would take complete control of the space immediately above the target world, before finally landing troops on the ground. It was a process that took weeks or even months to pull off, but it significantly reduced casualties. However successful the invasions were, McKenna began to realise that the task of uniting the Inner Sphere was beyond even his abilities by this point. He toned down his expansionist rhetoric and dispatched ambassadors to what he considered to be the significant interstellar nations. The Free Worlds League and Federated Suns were pleased to welcome these ambassadors and establish new trade deals with the hegemony. The Draconis Combine responded a little more coolly. They had their own ambitions of galactic conquest after all, but the two signed a neutrality agreement and agreed to stay out of each other's way. One group that was not invited to the talks was the Capellan Commonality, that group of loosely affiliated nations within the Capellan Zone. McKenna viewed them as insignificant pretenders and immediately took the side of the Federated Suns, who had recently concluded a deal to peacefully absorb the Marlette Association, and the Free Worlds League in all disputes. He also geared up for further expansion in that direction himself. First to make a move, however, was the Draconis Combine. Next in their sights was the peaceful Principality of Rasalhague. In 2330, they kicked off what all anticipated would be a short campaign. Initial progress was good, with Rasalhague constantly caught by surprise. The defenders were anticipating an attack on their capital, but it never came. Instead, they were losing their planets piecemeal. In preparation for their next attack, the Curitans began to stockpile weapons on New Bergen, which in 2334 was under the joint command of Urizen's two oldest sons. Tragedy struck for the Kurita family when a group of Rasalhagians landed on planet and conducted a surprise raid. Both brothers were killed and the supplies seized. This single counterattack resulted in decades of repercussions for both sides. The Principality now had the means to continue to fight the Draconis Combine almost indefinitely using guerrilla tactics. Urizen too never recovered from the loss of his sons and died a few years later, followed by his brother Shiro in 2348. In 67, Shiro's son Tenno declared the Combine's victory over Rasalhague, but in reality the outcome was a stalemate. Rasalhague managed to keep their independence in the end at the cost of having the Kurita family installed as governors, and also had to accept the Draconis military units within their borders, forming the basis of what would become the Rasalhague military district. Jumping back to 2332, the Capellans were taking advantage of the weakness of the Federated Suns military and seized a handful of worlds. Seeing the nation he'd worked so hard to build start to fall apart, Lucien Davion retired his presidency and passed away a few months later. His brother Charles took control of the Federated Suns after his retirement and immediately put pressure on the Terran Hegemony to begin the next wave of their military conquests. The Capellans were forced to scale back their assaults in 2335 when the Hegemony started to move, and by the following year Davion had retaken several of the Lost Worlds. Two of the main targets for the Third Terran campaign were within the borders of the Federation of Sky, though not strictly members of that nation. Initially, the third wave went as planned, but it was during this campaign that McKenna's son Conrad rose to command within the HAF. As they closed in on their final goal in 2338, Conrad increasingly disregarded standard operating procedure during the invasions. A mixture of arrogance and complacency played a part in the catastrophe that followed. As the Hegemony fleet appeared in system, they found themselves surrounded by an enormous minefield with dozens of remote-activated missiles set off by the ensuing blasts. Unable to clear the jump point, the troop transports, which had been commanded to follow immediately behind, materialized right on top of and inside the floundering first wave. Conrad shifted the blame onto his fellow admirals in the aftermath, and was soon facing a mutiny when he threatened to execute the senior officers. It was at this point that James McKenna himself unexpectedly arrived, the news having reached him on Earth, and relieved his son of command. What was left of the fleet was ordered back to Earth, and the invasion abandoned. The Director General was the last to leave the system, lingering for 3 hours as he surveyed the carnage. In the ensuing months, McKenna was stepped down as the head of the Hegemony, and died later that year. In his place, a distant relative, Michael Cameron, was elected the second Director General. With the ascension of House Cameron, the Inner Sphere would see the birth of another ruling dynasty at the head of a major state. Lastly, the 2330s would also see some major changes in the periphery. By 2335, the newly rechristened Taurian Concordat had expanded significantly, though contact with the outside world was limited to a very small group of traders from the Capellan zone. The biggest fear for the Calderon family was aggression from the Federated Suns, and because of that, they chose to keep their existence hidden. Across the Inner Sphere, the Rimworld's Republic had begun to expand in 2334, and by 38 now had more than a dozen worlds. Eventually, they came into contact with the Tamar Pact, were able to establish friendly relations, the two sides both more concerned about where the Draconis Combine would go next after the Principality of Rasalhague fell. It was because of this fear that the Tamars finally acted on something that had been whispered about for some years. Reaching out to the Federation of Sky and the Protectorate of Donegal, they called for an alliance between the three powers to defend from outward aggression. Sky had only recently been threatened by the Terran Hegemony, so had added impetus to join these talks. Donegal, Sky and Tamar were in agreement on many things, but struggled somewhat to reach consensus on how their new alliance would function. The compromise they settled on was intended to give each member nation a fair say, but would result in somewhat ineffectual leadership. Nevertheless, on January 5th, 2341, the Terran Alliance officially recognized the founding of the Lyran Commonwealth. All eyes and ambitions were now focused on the Capellan zone. Lucien's son Reynard Davion took control of the Federated Suns on the 21st of May 2340, after the death of his uncle Charles. Reynard was much more military-minded than the previous generation of Davions, and sought to bring the new might of his nation to bear against the Capellans. During Charles's reign, he had founded the Federated Peacekeeping Forces, a predecessor to the current-day AFFS, and used them to retake some of the worlds that had been lost. Now they had new targets. When the Marlat Association had joined the Federated Suns, they brought with them their rivalry with Tikhonov. Seeking to settle old scores, Reynard began his campaign in 2344, targeting several worlds in the Chesterton province of the Tikhonov Grand Union. The Union was in decline at this point, and after resisting for only a year, in 2345 signed the Almac Accords, handing control of the disputed planets over to the Federated Suns. They then cemented these territorial gains by concluding the Akala Pact with a Capellan commonality, ensuring that they would not support their ally in a counter-invasion. Sensing blood in the water, the always aggressive Sarno supremacy launched their own invasion of the Tikhonov Grand Union in 2351. By the end of the following year, the supremacy had taken control of the remaining Chesterton worlds. Both sides petitioned the Capellan Commonalty to support them in their case for ownership over these planets, and when help was not forthcoming, entered their own candidates into the running for governorship of what was essentially a foreign realm. Continued involvement of foreign powers in the election process eroded the common people's faith in the democratic process, until few believed that the commonalty was sustainable. The Federated Suns invasion of 2357 brought the reality of their situation sharply back into focus. Several worlds were taken, including Chesterton, and as a result of the fiasco, the government collapsed. In its place, a new one formed under the leadership of Seluk Tukas, who was able to assuage the rulers of Sarno and Tikhonov by supporting the former in their recent acquisitions, and promising the latter a renewed campaign to retake the worlds lost to House Davian. Tukas's immediate response was to send forces to the planet Bel, but upon arrival they found the colony completely deserted. 2363 was the year chosen for the counterattack on the Federated Suns. Renouncing the Akala and Almac Accords, the Commonalty went on the offensive, sending 8 crack regiments from Capella, St. Ives and Tikhonov to the planet Lee as the first step of their grand invasion. This was as far as they would go, however, as elements within the Supremacy government had leaked plans to the Federated Suns. Waiting for them on Lee were 10 regiments of Davian's finest. The ensuing bloodbath saw precious few of the Commonalty forces escape. Tukas would not long outlive them, and was assassinated in February 2365. The Aris family, dormant since the Hegemony Supremacy War, saw this moment to retake control of the region, but faced unexpectedly stiff opposition from their rivals in House Liao. At the conference held to discuss the future of the Capellan Zone nations, the mood was grim, as word had just reached the delegates that Reynard Davian had dispatched his fleet to Capella to ensure the validity of the next election. As the others bickered, Franco Liao made the bold suggestion to disband the Commonalty entirely. In its place would rise the Capellan Confederation, one strong, unified nation under the control of a single central figure. This new nation would be powerful enough to resist Davian aggression, he promised. The alternative was that he would use his extensive merchant navy to blockade all key worlds within the zone. His motion passed with a unanimous but one vote. After officially disbanding the Commonalty, he extended an olive branch to Warren Aris, offering to make him Deputy Chancellor. Aris threw the offer back in his face, so instead, he had him executed. Racing to Capella, Liao evacuated as many and as much as he could before the arrival of the Federated Suns fleet, leaving the system himself only hours before they appeared. The Davians soon moved into the deserted city. The Liao fleet jumped back in behind them. Confident that they would not fire upon their own city and civilians, the Davian commander refused to surrender, and made plans to contact New Avalon. Franco never gave him the opportunity. Every weapon available was fired upon Capella Prime, devastating the city, those left behind, and the FBF forces. In the aftermath, the Confederacy capital was moved to Siam, where it remains to this present day. Though most of the nations within the Capellan Zone ratified the foundation of the Confederacy, it was now the turn of the Tikhonovs to act contentiously. The Grand Union would outlive the other states, which were now rebranded as commonalities within the Greater Confederacy, and the two groups initially maintained an awkward semi-independent neutrality. The nobility of Tikhonov turned to creating private armies to defy laws coming from Siam. Franco decided to make an example of one especially troublesome unit known as Tormasov's Galactic Rangers. He maneuvered his own forces onto their planet and attacked the gang, chasing them off-world. As they fled, they unknowingly entered the Taurian Concordat, where they were shocked to come into contact with what was at the time an unknown nation. As Tormasov discussed an alliance with this new group, the Capellans arrived. In the confusion, the Tikhonov unit was able to steal several Taurian jump ships, and made their next move into Davian space, where they were finally destroyed. Seeking the source of this presumed Capellan raid, Reynard Davian moved rimward and stumbled upon the Concordat himself. Not recognizing them as an independent nation, he attacked. At last the cover had been blown, and the Taurians were forced to fight back. The ensuing short war saw both the Federated Suns and the Taurian Concordat develop a lasting hatred for each other. The conflict only ended with the death of Reynard Davian in 2371. On the opposite side of the sphere, Robert Marsden launched a coup to take complete control of the Lyran Commonwealth. Disgusted by the way the ruling Archons were taking advantage of the economic crisis that was bankrupting millions of citizens, he was finally able to forge the Commonwealth into a functional nation. Tamara and Skye at first resisted, but Marsden dispatched his military forces, loyal from his prior service, to crush them into submission. The looming threat of a Kurita attack kept the realm from flying apart. A period of peace settled on the galaxy in the wake of the hostilities. Nobody knew it at the time, but this was nothing but a brief respite before the devastating Age of War that would follow.